Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week number 3 of our Senior Tech Tuesdays that are associated with our Protecting Your Data and Privacy class. This, like I mentioned, is week number 3, and here is the profile of the class in terms of the topics that we have pursued to this point. This week, being week number 3, we are going to be exploring Keychain, Apple Keychain, or you could call it iCloud Keychain, as a password manager. That is our primary topic for this week. So welcome everybody, and I hope everybody is doing well. Our learning plan for today, right? The topics that we want to explore. We are going to start out just reviewing some of the concepts that we started to discuss last week around the idea of good password practice. I'm going to pull out another couple of tips, and we will just review that. As we stressed last week, having a strong password is an important element of your strategy for keeping the bad guys out of your data. Right, so we'll review that. Item number 2. One of the recommendations that the experts are making these days is that because of the rules that we suggest that we'll review from point number 1 in today's plan, because of all of these quote unquote rules or good ideas or good strong password practices, a password manager is a big help. And many of the experts just flat out recommend that if you want to have solid security, it would be a good idea for you to use a password manager. So what we're going to do is we're going to define what it is. All right, what is a password manager, and what can you essentially expect from it? Point number 3 in today's plan is, we are going to be presenting, or in the lesson this week, we are presenting information about iCloud Keychain. And so Keychain is the password manager that Apple presents to you, and it has most of the key benefits that people are looking for from a password manager, and so we'll make some recommendations around that, right? And then finally, we want to walk through not only the setup of Keychain, but do a walkthrough on some of the capabilities of the tool and what it would look like, so that you can come away from this session having some confidence that if you decide to use a password manager like Keychain, you have some confidence in terms of what it's able to do, and some knowledge of what to look for. So that is today's plan. Excuse me one second. We started talking last week that we have this password challenge. And I want you to take a look at this particular password challenge. This is not the password challenge that we are talking about. All right, how many of you, give me a show of hands because I have a lot of cameras on today. How many of you remember the name of the host of the password game show? How many of you remember the host, the name of the host? How many of you remember the host as being Mr. Betty White? Right, in that he was a long-term marriage partner, spouse of Betty White, all right, many years, right? And of course the name is Alan Ludden. And so yeah, this This was a prime time anchor, for some time of of network game shows. And so my point here is that this is not the password challenge that we are talking about. The password challenge that we want to talk about really relates more to the challenge of using strong passwords. All right. I reached into the library of an agency in the Department of Homeland Security. It's called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, sometimes known as CISA. And they have a tip sheet. And one of the recommendations on their tip sheet that you have good password practice. And the top 3 items on their good password practice tip sheet included these 3 items. Number 1, that when you use passwords, it's important that you create strong passwords. We're going to review that a little more. They recommend that you use multi-factor authentication. That was the topic from last week also. And tip number 3 is they ask you to consider using a password manager. And frankly, the reason that you might want to consider using a password manager is so that you can do a better job with item number 1 right on this list. That would be the whole reason to do that. Let's review a little bit. So last week, we talked about the importance of using strong passwords. And so that discussion started out last week with a bunch of things to avoid, right, in your passwords. And so I'm talking about a situation where you're coming up to a website. It could even be a website like the seniortechclub.com website. Although, I always tend to tell people, we're not Fort Knox here. You don't have to have a lot of security for my website. I don't accept any money, all right? So it's a pretty safe place to hang out. But you're at a website, maybe you're shopping, and now you are asked to create your account for that shopping experience. And so you're going to create a username, which is oftentimes your email address, and then you're going to create a password. And the experts tell us that in that password that you create, you want to avoid personal information, names, your street name, your house number, right? You want to avoid information that might be, that a bad person could look up. You want to avoid common sequences. I showed you a list last week of the most common weak passwords that were used. Common sequences like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or the word password, all right, would be examples. Or you want to avoid regular words that could be found in a dictionary, all right? You avoid these concepts. We also talked last week how you generally want to use longer passwords. And it's better if those passwords can contain some combination of uppercase, lowercase letters, maybe a symbol, maybe a number. If that password is a random password, that's outstanding. Or it could be a passphrase or the result of a formula like we shared last week, right? Those are all good password practices. And then I think this third item down here is the kicker. And this is the one that really highlights the use or the need for the use of a password manager. And that is when you construct a great password, you don't want to use that password for multiple websites, right? You want to have unique passwords on each website. And so then the challenge becomes, well, how do you remember all of those passwords? How do you use a strong password practice when you work with a dozen or 20 or 50 different websites that require you to log in, right? So those items really, give us motivation to consider password managers. See, I want to do an update right before we go on, because one of the questions that came in from the community last week was the idea of password changes, right? And I know I came from a corporate environment too, where it was a requirement that when you create a password for something, that you regularly change that password. You might be required that corporate site might actually require you to change that password every 60 days, right? As an example, right? Well, I had, when that discussion came up yesterday, I had this inkling that something had changed. And I just wanted to make sure my answer wasn't great last week, right? In that the experts now tell us that the current thinking is that, regularly changing passwords doesn't add that much to your password strategy. And this is not something that came out of my head or came out of casual reading. There is a National Institute of Standards and Technology, along with Microsoft, and why Microsoft is important in this space is because they are very active in corporate security, network logins and so forth and so on. So they no longer recommend that you have to change your password regularly, right? So what that means for us, I think, is that we can put more focus on creating strong passwords, and then we go with those strong passwords, right? In that we don't have to worry about changing those passwords on a regular basis. They actually cited that many people who had to change passwords in corporate environments, they would oftentimes, and I know I was guilty of this too, I would just re-enter essentially the same password and put a number at the end of it, all right? That in my case, it was a number that I generally associated with the month of the year. And so, like, if you were doing that in the month of May, you might have your strong password and put 05 at the end of it. Well, the bad folks are, they're in tune to that, that strategy too. So anyway, that was the question that came up next week. And in effect, I don't think my answer was accurate right last week, in that the general recommendation these days is, no, put more of your emphasis on having a good solid password. Don't worry about having a regular change to that password. Going back to the CISA document, the second tip, right, that was on that CISA document was that you should use multi-factor or two-factor authentication. I take those two concepts, multi-factor and two-factor authentication, as being synonymous, right? And so this is the process whereby when you log on to, and my key example would be a site like, another site would like PayPal, right? When I log on to PayPal, because I'm going to be making a purchase on eBay, right? I log onto PayPal. When I submit my login and password, it comes back and says, we're sending you a text message, right? And we take that text message, and it is then going to prompt for that code that they send in that text message. Right? We talked last week how two-factor authentication can significantly enhance the security of your access to sites that generally only require a login and a password. So we talked about that last week. And my wish associated with two-factor authentication is that number one, you understand it, right? You understand how it's going to work, that it's going to be simple as, okay, I'm probably going to receive a text message with a code and I'm going to have to submit that code, right? Number two, that you accept the fact that it's going to take you an extra 20 seconds to log on to a site, right? But it's going to get less over time because you're going to have your phone there. You're going to know, you're going to understand it, and you're going to be able to turn around and submit that code very quickly. And that my wish is that you set it up and you use it, particularly for those critical sites. Now, do not look for two-factor authentication on the seniortechclub.com site, right? Not all websites offer it, right? But I think what you're going to find today is that most of your sites that have financial transactions are now offering two-factor authentication. So that was tip number two, right? In that you should be using two-factor authentication. And then we come around to the topic of the day, and that is the CISA recommendations suggested that you should consider using a password manager. And so how we want to spend the bulk of our time today is exploring, number one, what is it? What do you expect from a password manager? Number two, we want to take a look at what does Apple Keychain provide. Step number three, we're going to show you a couple of setup steps. Right, it's pretty straightforward and easy. And step number four, we are going to talk about using what you can expect it to look like when you use Keychain as a password manager. Right, this is our plan for the day. Let's jump in. So question number one, what is a password manager? All right, I created a definition and changed it to basically come down to 2 points, right? And that is, number one, a password manager is an online digital place to store your passwords, right? Because if you think of it, we're asking you to create unique, strong passwords for every website that you work on, and you need a place to store them. You need a secure place to store them, maybe not unlike of what you can think of when you talk about a safe deposit box that you might have in a bank. Now, I know that not everybody has those anymore, but I still have my safe deposit box where I have my property titles and some of the important papers of my life. It needs to be secure. So it's a secure place to store your passwords. The second item of a password manager is it is going to need to present some essential password functions. And I broke this down to 4. Right? A good password manager should, at a minimum, provide these 4 functions. Number one, you want it to be able to help you collect and update your passwords. Now, you may have already seen this, where you are in the process of logging in to Amazon.com and you submit your username and your password, and your browser, your web browser, pops up and says, do you want to remember this password? A good password manager should help you collect these passwords. And it should also help you update these passwords when they change. Right? And the update is fairly straightforward, you think of it. Basically, you have submitted a password to Amazon.com, and your password manager comes up and says, hey, wait, this password that you just submitted is different than the password that I was storing. Do you want me to update? Right? Really straightforward and simple. Right, so that's function number one that a good password manager should do. Function number two is you would expect a password manager to help you submit your logins and your passwords. Right, and so that now when you log on to a site like Amazon.com and you submit your username, your email address oftentimes, and then you enter either thumb type, you enter your password, right? That's how you do it without a password manager. But with a password manager, basically you come on to Amazon.com, you go to the login screen, and the password manager says, hey, do you want to log on to Amazon.com? I've got your username and password. And you just say, yeah, go for it. And it will actually submit that information for you so that you get a couple of advantages from that. Number one, you didn't have to look it up, right? Because remember, we're storing those usernames and passwords. And then number two, you didn't have to type it. Right, so that's the type of help that I'm talking about, where you can look to the password manager tool to not only collect and store your passwords, but it will help you submit those logins and passwords at various sites. Essential function number three. Yeah, Brenda, question.
So what is different about password managers for getting breached versus accounts getting breached? Because I've always felt like, okay, you have all these passwords in one little pot there, and so what is the extra safeguard about? I mean, I understand the purpose, I think they're a good idea, but how is it different? Because everything's concentrated in one place now.
Yep. Okay. Let me defer that question because I'm going to address that. All right. I promise I'm going to come back and talk about that, because that, that single point of risk is one of the challenges. But I'll come back and talk about that. Paul, how about you? Your question?
Yes, I do, Don. This just came up when I was trying to figure two-factor identification. I use I must be signed up for password managers because I get that exact same message. You want this password, or do you want to change it, and things like that. But because that window shows up when I'm trying to log in, I don't seem to get a window to use two-factor.
Okay.
Does this bypass the two-factor process?
There is some potential of that, but it's not going to happen automatically. All right. In fact, I'll show you that definition too. Again, I'm going to ask you to hold that question until we get into the meat, right, of Keychain, because that is one of the advantages of Keychain, is it can provide assistance in the two-factor authentication in some cases.
Okay.
All right. Option number three. All right. Function number three. And that is a password manager should be able to help you generate strong passwords. Right now, you could still use a formula like we talked about last week, but a good password manager is oftentimes able to see that, oh, you're entering a new password, how about this one? And they would generate a random password for you that would be long, be almost impossible to guess. All right, so that's a third benefit. And then I think a fourth benefit of a good password manager is that it is going to monitor your passwords looking for weaknesses. Right, so as an example, if you have used a password that's too simple, if you've used a password like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, a good password manager should be able to come up and say, hey, that one's pretty weak. Or, on the other hand, if a site has been breached and this password is available out on the dark web, right? it should be able to monitor that and make a recommendation that says you should change that password. All right, so these are the 4 general recommendations that I feel a good password manager should have. Now, there are more things that you find in password managers. For example, going back to Paul's question, some of these password managers will play a role in two-factor authentication. Apple Keynote will help with two-factor authentication. Some password managers will remember your credit cards and addresses and do autofill when you're shopping. Keynote does this. I'll have a sheet where it talks about Keynote's capabilities. Some password managers allow you to create notes, documents, right? Or in some cases, put in other types of information, right? Sometimes you need, you need other information at your, easily disposable in a secure location. Something like, I just purchased automobile license tabs for my car. And when you do that, you need to put in your policy number for your auto insurance, right? And so, it would be nice to be able to have a place where you could safely store information like that. Some password managers do great for sharing. That is, maybe you want to be able to share a password with another individual. And then finally on this list, some password managers will offer emergency access, right? So what happens if you're in the ICU after a car accident and a family member needs to have access to your stuff, all right, to your financial accounts. And so in this particular case, some of the password managers offer this type of function. Now, by way of full disclosure, all right, I do not use Apple Keychain, right? And earlier, Tom in our community here, he disclosed that he uses a password manager called OnePass. There are a number of password managers out in the marketplace. Some of them are very popular. All right, 1Password, LastPass, Keeper, these are all very popular password managers and are generally very well regarded by their users and reviewers. Now, in my particular case, I spend about $50 a year to use LastPass. Apple Keychain, by the way, is going to be free for you. I like it for a couple of things, right? I like it because, number one, I have a history of LastPass. I've been using it for 5 years, and I actually have over 400 items in my LastPass vault, they say. All right, they call it. Now, they're not all passwords. There's probably a couple hundred passwords for different sites, right, that I use. But on the other hand, there's a lot of history there. I like it because of other items. I can store not only credit cards and addresses, but policy numbers and all kinds of security items in LastPass. This is a big one. I like it for its support of all of the devices that I use. And that includes Windows computers, that includes Android smartphones, and it works across all of the platforms. Apple Keychain, not quite as good in that space. I'll talk more about that. But here's a big winner. I like LastPass because of the emergency access that it provides, where I have granted my son emergency access to all of my stuff. And so if he, if I'm in the ICU and can't manage my affairs through the emergency access strategy, my son would be able to get in and access the passwords from my bank accounts, and any of the other financial sites that I work with. Right now, that's my full disclosure. Let's take a look at the Apple Keychain list that come to you for free. Right now, where I have highlighted in yellow on this, so on this list of functions that I described before, right? The yellow highlights are the nopes, the things that Apple Keychain does not do. Right? So, for instance, Apple Keychain will help collect passwords, submit passwords, generate strong passwords, monitor for weakness, help with 2FA, remember credit cards and addresses, right? And do the autofill. Apple Keynote will store notes, but it's not set up to store, insurance policy numbers, right? Apple Keynote will do some sharing of somebody that's next to you locally, right, via AirDrop, but you can't send a text message, as an example, or otherwise share a password, right, from Keynote. Keynote does not offer emergency access, right, on the order that some of the other password managers have. And then finally, number 10, Apple Keynote does offer a Windows app, right? So those of you, I know in this community, there are people that use iPhones, iPads, but have a Windows computer, right, that they use. Apple does have a Windows app that will support your use of Keynote, right? So that's all pretty good. My point in presenting this list is that the price on Apple Keychain is right, and it may be a good option for it. Now, what are your decision criteria, right, for selecting a password manager, right? Number one, has to be security. Do you trust it? And this kind of goes back to Brenda's question, right? Where the question might be, given the fact that you are using a tool like a keychain or a LastPass or a 1Password to store your passwords, isn't there some risk of that site or that tool being breached? Remote. The answer is yes, there is a risk. But I think if you go out and if you look at the recommendations of the experts, this is not me saying this, but the recommendation of the experts is that the risk associated with a major site being breached like that is worth the strength that you get with your day-to-day password processes. Now, I'm not dismissing that risk, right, because it's always possible that in my case LastPass could be breached, and in fact they were breached back in 2008, somewhere in that time frame. But the experts, these are companies whose livelihoods are based on having rock solid security, right? And I take some confidence of that. And we're also not talking about sites that have a dozen users. LastPass has millions of users. If you use Apple Keychain, you are going to join millions of users that are using that tool, right? So Brenda, the answer to your question, yes, it is possible for a site to be breached. But these are sites that have been tuned for security, and the experts are telling us that it is worth that risk. Decision criteria number 2, does it provide the functions that you need? Right? Decision number 3, is it easy and is it accessible? Right? One of the reasons why I think you might want to consider, if you're not using a password manager at all, you might want to consider using Keychain because it is easy and accessible. And then finally, does it work on the computers and the devices that you need? Right? Does it offer you support for your Windows computer, or does it work with your iPhones and iPads? And so my recommendations within this space, this is what I'm recommending to this community, is that if you are using another password manager, as we already know, Tom had full disclosure before. I know Barb, talked about a password manager that she uses. If you are using another password manager and you are happy with the function of that password manager, just like if somebody came to me and said, hey, you should look at Keychain, I'm going to say, no, I'm happy with where I'm at. Right? Even though I pay $50 a year for that, I'm happy with what it provides. Right? So that's recommendation one. If you're using another password manager already, I would probably say stick with it if you're happy with it. Recommendation number two is if you are not using a password manager at this point, if you have no password manager in your life and you use Apple devices and Mac computers, to me, Keychain is a definite. All right, it's a great way to get started. Recommendation number three. If you do not have a password manager and you use Windows, I think you should take a good look at it. I have tested the Windows application, right, of the password manager, and I didn't find it to be quite as good as LastPass, but it was pretty workable, right? So that's a definite yes. I would recommend Keychain because the price is right, it's very accessible, and it's easy to use. All right, now let me go back to Paul. I'm going to address your question about 2FA. I'm going to show you a setup item on that a little bit. Brenda, how about your question? On the on the risk of a password site being breached.
Yeah, that you did address it. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see what else is popping up on questions. Yeah, the question is, I'm going to talk about one of the things that you definitely want to do. The question came in, if your passwords on Keychain don't jibe on various devices, it probably means you don't have the iCloud Keychain activated, because it would be the iCloud. I'll show you that setup in just a bit. The answer to Marilyn's question, does your emergency contact have to have LastPass? Yes, they do. They at least have to have a LastPass account in order to access those passwords. Can I import data into Keychain from another password manager? All right, I use 1Password. So Kim, that kind of goes back, if 1Password is doing the trick for you, I'm not recommending that you necessarily switch, right? Most of the tools will offer some capability to do imports and exports. Apple's is pretty weak. If you have a Mac computer and they have a special tool that you can use to import items into your Keychain database, but in my review of it, it was not for the faint of heart, all right? And so Kim G, the short answer to your question is there is some capabilities to import information, but it is not particularly easy. On Keychain, can I print out a hard copy paper listing of all of my passwords? The only place that you could do that would be on a Mac computer using the Keychain app, right, that you can get on a password on the Mac computer. It's not particularly straightforward, right? Most of these do not, feel that you actually need to print this out. Marilyn asked, if you use 2FA, should you share your phone passcode with someone just in case you are unable to open your phone? I do think that as you put together your list of contingency items, so that you want to be able to, I think as part of your, let's call it your estate plan, right? You probably want to have items that you share with an important person in your life, and I think your passcode for your device is one of those items, right? Just like you might share your login and password for your bank account, you probably also want to put your iPhone passcode into that same list. All right. So Carrie's question, when I save my passwords on my Dell computer, do they go to the cloud or do they stay on my computer only? It depends on what's saving it for you. All right. Most times people encounter these messages from your browsers, like your Chrome browser or your Microsoft Edge browser. And these are like password managers, but oftentimes they are not as full functioning, as those as the dedicated password managers. Again, when I read what the experts share with us, they tend to prefer fairly dedicated password managers over what you might get from Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge. Right. And so Carrie, going back to your question, it kind of depends on what what's capturing those passwords for you. All right. Chances are, unless you have implemented a password manager, it's just one of your browsers, and then it all depends. There's too many variables to answer your question, right? Anybody have a template for the contingency info we all should have for life planning? That's a good question. Let me whoever is, I cannot tell who is 947478 right in the user list. But if you
Don, it's Sue.
Okay, if you would send me an email, all right, I will look for a template. I know I have seen them, but I don't have one to offer unless anybody else has one. And so this might be, what does a document look like that has some of this contingency information? If you weren't going to be using a password manager, this is not so much in my estate planning is not in my space, right? I don't suggest that I'm a resource that you can count on for legal advice in terms of what you should be capturing, but I would share a template if I can find one. And then finally, there's another question. What good password manager is good if you use both Mac, Apple, and Windows devices? I think any of the major ones. What I have seen, I use LastPass, right? And I have all of those devices. Tom said earlier, before we actually started, that he's happy with 1Password. And I'm assuming that he has a variety of devices too. If you go out and you find, if you find a list of top password managers, chances are any of the tools that are on those lists are going to be good. But I would recommend LastPass, as a strategy, and it sounded like Tom would recommend 1Password. Mary Kay says there are books. Check AARP for those types of templates, I'm assuming. Right, so that's a good idea. AARP is a great resource for some of these conversations. All right, I want to be talking about Keychain, and I want to walk through the process of setting up Keychain, and also start to describe what it's going to look like when you use Keychain as your password manager. By the way, this is phenomenal. These questions, it tells me that there's a lot of interest, right, in these tools, and people recognize that passwords are kind of a pain. I need help, right, with passwords, and these are some of the strategies. First of all, if you're going to set up Keychain on your device, there are really two steps. There are really two setup processes on your iPhone. Step number one is you want to set up iCloud Keychain, and step number two, you want to make sure that autofill is turned on. Right, you can follow along with me if you want in this case. Now, this might be, setting up, doing a full setup on Keychain might not be the type of thing that you want to do during the next 9 minutes, right, of our discussion today, right? But let's do a walkthrough, and you can certainly go into the settings app and look for these settings. All right, so one of the things that you're likely going to want to do is you're going to want to set up Keychain on iCloud, right? iCloud Keychain is essential to be able to synchronize your passwords across your devices and across your computers, right? So the way that you would look for that is you would go into the settings app, you tap on your name up at the top, you tap on iCloud below, and then under iCloud you would tap on Keychain, and you would turn on iCloud Keychain so that the switch is green, and that's what you're looking at over on this side here. By the way, this exact set of steps is on the online lesson. So in other words, if you can't capture it here in our discussion, it's on this exact screenshot is on the online lesson for this week. Step number 2 in the setup process is that Keychain is going to be a lot more useful if you give it an opportunity to autofill, right? And that's the place where it will help you with your login process, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to go into the settings app once again. You're going to scroll down until you see passwords. When you access this, be prepared to authenticate either using Face ID, Touch ID, or your password. That's all, or your passcode, right? That's all dependent upon your setup. But this is actually good to know. All right, so going back, to a question that you might have about security, right? This authentication at this particular step is really Apple's or Keychain's intent to make sure that you are you, right? And that this is not some rogue person that is accessing your settings in order to steal your passwords. There is a green button when you turn on autofill, and then down below you should have a check mark by iCloud Keychain. On my particular iPhone, I actually also have LastPass, right, identified down here, right? So if you are using an alternative, you might have that alternative tool setting. That's it for the setup. So what you want to do, what you want to do is you want to set up iCloud Keychain, and then you want to set up the autofill capability, and that's really all there is. Mary Kay, your question. Oh, maybe it wasn't Mary Kay. There was another.
Was Barb. It's Barb.
Oh, hi, Barb.
When I get into autofill and toggle it on, I don't have that following option, allow filling from iCloud Keychain.
Okay, I think that probably means that you don't have anything else that might be participating in that. And so I think you're
right.
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think you're good. I have this definitely because of the fact that, I have an alternative tool on mine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Don,
Yes, question.
this is the other Barb. What if you're sharing accounts with your spouse and you have to, how does that work if you have to do the ID and stuff?
So, depends on how you're talking about sharing accounts.
So, I mean, we have the same bank accounts and stuff.
Sure.
Can I access it? Could he still access it if I set up Keychain for me? And
So-
he has an Android phone, which is also another difference between the two of us.
Okay, so that's going to be challenging. All right, an Android, isn't going to get support, all right, from Apple Keychain. So in a case like what you're describing, the passwords that you store in Keychain are going to be associated with your Apple ID, right? That is the key identifier from Apple's perspective. And so if you're talking, Barb, if you're talking about a spouse that also has an iPhone, and if that spouse has that iPhone set up to use a separate Apple ID, right, you would then have separate password sets, right? Because the Keychain passwords are associated with your Apple ID.
Okay.
If you have an account that you share, it would be no problem for both of you having that same password in your Keychain repository. Not a problem, because they're separate, right? The repositories are separate, but you could both be using that. But if your husband is using an Android, that's a case where I would frankly say, maybe something like a LastPass or a 1Password might be a better solution, because you can then do a better job of sharing across those platforms.
Or maybe a new phone for my husband.
I won't touch that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question. Yes.
This is Lisa. Hi.
Hi, Lisa.
I just get, when I put that in, autofill passwords, I don't get Keychain. What comes up is security recommendation.
Yeah. So if you don't have any other alternatives, I have the selection because I have multiples in mine. And so if you are prompted for that other item, right, then you make sure that you have a check mark by the right one. If you don't have anything there, then you're good. Okay? All right, capturing passwords. All right, so once Keychain is set up, you would then be able to go to a website and log into that website as you normally would. This happens to be, I don't know, this site that's called seniortechclub.com. And you could log into that site with your username and your password. If Keychain is not familiar with that site, it would then ask you, do you want to save that password? And you would respond yes. So when I talked earlier about one of the functions that a good password manager should offer is the ability to help you collect your passwords, right? This is an example of that. So you would say yes. Now, you might say, well, don't I get that same prompt from, if you use Google Chrome or Firefox? Well, but that's just associated with your browser. All right, we want to make sure, if you're heading down this path, the experts still recommend, use a more dedicated password manager, right? So Keychain is going to help you collect or capture these passwords. It'll then put it into the password database, so to speak. Right. So what about using Keychain passwords, let's say in Safari? Right, so let's assume that you have previously saved the password for the Senior Tech Club. And now you go to the login screen. So the login function is up under the hamburger menu up at the top, and you go to the login screen. And at that particular point, you have to put your cursor into one of the fields, right, as though you were going to type. And then you get a prompt at the bottom of the screen that asks you, do you want to use this login to access this site? And if you tap on that button at the bottom of the screen, it will then submit that username and that password for you. You have to be a little bit patient. The reason I put an X through this login button is that many times you don't even have to tap the login button. That keychain is going to actually enter the username, enter the password, and press the login button for you. So that's why you have to be just a little bit patient to see that it's taking place. Right? It is very easy, very painless. Now, if you are using keychain on a Mac computer or an iPad, this process looks very much the same, where you come onto the site and it'll then ask you, do you want to use the stored password? Updating passwords. Let's say that you had to go through a forgot your password process on the SeniorTechClub.com site. And so you submitted, forgot my password, you got the email, right, that will enable a password change. You click on the email, you submit a new password. And now you're going to come back around and log in again. One of the things that Keychain will do is it will be able to identify that your password is changed. You're submitting a different password than what it is storing, and it'll come up on the screen and ask you, do you want to update the password that I'm storing? Again, it helps you. One of the things I want to state though real clearly in this process is that that keychain, and for really all of the password managers, they are not able to change your password for you, right? You still have to make the password changes yourself. And if you think of it, every site, has a different function or a different method for updating or changing your passwords, right? What the password manager can do is aid in that process, right? But it is not going to be able to change your password for you. But it can sense when your password changes, and it'll ask you, do you want to update the password? Right? By the way, these steps are all on the online lesson, right, that you can review if anything you miss here today. You can view the passwords. And so that if you go into the Settings app and you tap on Passwords and Face ID, Touch ID, or whatever, you can get a full listing of all of your passwords. You tap on AARP and you will get a screen like what you see on the right-hand side, where in this particular case, here, I'm going to move it over a little bit, where in this particular case, you can see the username, the password. You can set up the verification code. Paul, going back to your question, this is one of the places where Keychain can actually help you, and it will actually intercept that verification code so that you don't even get prompted for it. Right, so it is a relatively new function, but it does facilitate the use of two-factor authentication. By the way, you can go into the online lesson and you can see that there is a strategy for adding passwords, editing passwords, deleting passwords, making changes to that. You can all make those changes manually if you so desire. For instance, if you want to manually add a password, right? So rather than just capturing a password, you want to manually add it. There is a plus sign on your password screen that you can then tap in order to get three fields. And the three fields are the website, the username, and the password. Right? In this particular case, this password database, right, really is simple, right? In getting it from here, you only have three fields, and so this could be an alternative to recording that password in a notebook, right? Because this is going to be secure, and it will be something that you can reference whenever you need it. Here's another thing that Keychain does. I think this is one area where Keychain is better than what I use. I use LastPass, right? Keychain integrates this better, so that when you go into the password screen, right, this is settings, password, and you get a list of your passwords, there is a place here where you can tap on security recommendations. And over here, this is, by the way, from mine, this is telling me that for Walgreens, I am reusing a password. And it's recommending that I change the password, right? Because I'm reusing it from another site. All right, I'm breaking one of the password tips. Here's another one. For Yelp.com. Yelp is where I occasionally access that to get recommendations. And it says here that this password appears in a data lake, which puts this account at high risk. Right? I'm willing to tolerate that. It's just Yelp. I don't do any financial transactions on Yelp. I guess I probably should change it, right? But this is a place where Keychain is basically telling me, hey, you know, this password is out there, right? You might want to change it, right? These security recommendations are good, and the nice thing about it is they're just integrated right into this process. Okay. Now the online lesson has the description of each of those steps, and we'll break it down. And so if you are interested in jumping into this, you can use that that online lesson in order to break out the details. One of the things that I wanted to do, just in ending our time here together, I'm sorry I'm keeping you overtime once again. I am interested in doing a full demo of what this looks like. And give me 1 second here. I have to make some adjustments. I have to get my iPhone back up. Okay, so I'm going to do a demo of what Keychain is going to look like. And to do this demo, I am going to do a logout. I'm going to go to the Senior Tech Club site. All right. So I'm on Senior Tech Club. And as we talked about before, the first time you do this, you are going to just enter your username and your password as you would normally do. So I have a test account here that is called Sally. Her name is Sally. And this is her email address. This is testing my typing. Okay, so there's my username. Here's my password. I am just going to type it. All right, just as I would normally do, I type it. And I sign in. I tap sign in. All right, and I have a message. I got a message on the screen that says login was successful. In other words, I had the right username and I had the right password. And now at the bottom of the screen, it gives me an option to save that password. So I'm going to click on Save Password. Now that password is saved. I'd like to show that to you in a couple different ways. First of all, I'm going to go into Settings. I'm going to go into my Settings app, and I am going to scroll down until I find Passwords. All right, and so I can click on Passwords. I don't know if you could see that, but I got this Face ID authentication. So when I went into Passwords, Keychain was basically saying, wait, I want to make sure that you're done, all right, before I let you in to take a look at these passwords. And now I am going to scroll down. I have quite a few passwords in Keychain, but I am going to scroll down, and sure enough, there is a brand new record for Sally Student at thetechclub.com. If I tap on it here, it is going to show me what everything is. Right? And in fact, it's giving me a recommendation saying, you know, your password is a little bit too easy. All right, which is true. All right, I made an easy password so I could type it easily in front of you. But I can actually do some maintenance on this password. Right, so now I want to go back out to Safari once again. And I am going to log out just using a standard logout command. All right, so I just logged out. And now I actually have a message on the screen. Because I'm sitting in my user box, it's actually asking me, do you want to log on to seniortechclub.com with Sally Student? If I tap on Sally Student down at the bottom, it uses Face ID to authenticate me. I get a log on successful message, and it totally logged me on. Right? I did not have to press the login key. Right. So in this particular case, what I had done was I went to the Senior Tech Club and I logged in as though Keychain was not aware of that site. I entered my username and I typed my password, just like you would normally have to do. It asked me if I wanted to save the password. I said yes. We then went over to the Settings app under Settings Passwords, and we were able to browse the whole list of passwords, and sure enough, there was Sally Student for the Senior Tech Club. I tapped it. I was able to view it. It actually gave me a recommendation that it was too weak. And then finally, we went back out to Safari after I logged out, meaning I would have to log in again. Then I discovered that I did not have to type my username and password coming in the second time. Those are the key functions that you are going to get from a password manager. All right. Now, let me pause for questions.
Hey, Don.
Yes.
This is Patricia. So this is probably a dumb question, but do I have to go, if I have an iPad and an iPhone, do I have to go into each one, into the settings to make sure that everything is turned on and set up correctly, or by just doing it on my iPhone? Does it all sync over?
I believe,
magically?
I believe you're gonna, if you should only have to set up the iCloud component of the setup in one place. But I suspect that you have to go into the passwords autofill and set that up in both locations, in both devices. But then as long as you have that iCloud set up, it should synchronize those passwords between the two devices.
Okay. Thank you.
And Anthony asked the question, why do I have multiple password entries on some of my accounts in Password Keychain? Good question. I don't know, if you have multiple accounts going on. What I see is that I can have multiple login accounts for each website, but then I can actually choose which one I want to use, right? But I don't know in your particular case why you would have multiple password entries. You know, unless you were typing. Even then, it should have given you an update strategy instead. I don't know, Anthony. I would just monitor it. You know, maybe do some cleanup if you decide you're going to jump into this and use it. Do a little bit of cleanup, and then because I do not think that you should be getting, duplicates, right, in this process. Marilyn.
I was looking at mine a lot lately, and that happens to me too. But I noticed that the website that's recorded is slightly different. But if you click on it, you go to the same page. So I think the manager is saving each password for each different website that you go through to get to that page.
Sure, that could very well be. Yeah, that could very well be. In fact, let me lay out a scenario where if you log on from the home page versus logging on from a shopping cart, right? That could be a different address that it is recording separately. That is a possibility. That's a good one to monitor.
Hey, Don.
Yes, question.
Yes, I like the demonstration. A couple things I noticed. As you started to log in, it did not ask you for two-factor ID as you logged in.
It did not.
But then as you went through the other parts of it, it looked like there was a button you could press to have two-factor ID. So if I want two-factor ID as I go through and clean up all my passwords, should I press that button each time to initiate it?
All right. So, two-factor authentication, requires a partnership between your device and the website, right? So the first place to set it up is going to be at the website. So in other words, if you want to set up two-factor authentication for PayPal, right, you have to enable it first at PayPal.
Okay.
And then you can enable the function back on your phone to help with that.
Okay. All right.
There's a I did not write that process up in my online lesson, but in the online lesson, let me just show you. There are some. Here we go. So this is the class page, and I am going to go to using Keychain for stronger passwords. And then if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, those of you who need more information, I'm scrolling all the way down to the bottom. I wrote up a lot, all right, about this, but under additional information at the bottom, there is a guide from the iPhone user guide that says automatically fill in verification codes on iPhone. That's for easier two-factor authentication. So that'll take you into the Apple guide for setting this up. Those of you who have Windows computers, Anthony, in your case, if you want to try out Keychain on Windows, I also included a link here, iCloud for Windows User Guide. Set up iCloud passwords on your Windows computer. That will walk you through the steps, and these are both from Apple, right? So you know that they're pretty solid documentation sets. Okay, other questions? Great questions, by the way. Marilyn.
I have one. When I set up LastPass, it said to turn off, I think, all these other password fill-in things. But as I've been using it, I noticed Keychain is coming up. So is that an issue to have both of them running?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think when that's my opinion, right? That I think if you commit to using a password manager like a LastPass or a 1Password or a Keychain, right, you want to make sure to eliminate the other stuff, right? Because they're not going to synchronize, right? They are not going to stay in sync, right? And so in your particular case, if Keychain is showing up, what I would do is I would go into that passwords and where you did the setup of the autofill, you should see LastPass. If you've installed the LastPass app right on your phone, you should see LastPass show up under autofill. So you would turn on LastPass and uncheck keychain. Okay, it should be that simple, and you get the same thing on a Windows computer. You know, for a long time I had a bugaboo where I had Google Chrome as my browser coming up and asking me about passwords all the time, and I had to look up how to deactivate that because I was using LastPass, right? And that actually made my life easier once I got rid of some of the other prompting.
So Don, on that same note, if Authenticator is in your list, what the heck is that?
So that could be Microsoft Authenticator, possibly.
Okay.
So
you can only really have one thing checked under that listing of.
No, you could
keychain.
have multiples, but we should. I'm curious where Authenticator is coming from.
I have no idea.
When I think of Authenticator, I think of Microsoft Authenticator, and this is their app that aids in two-factor authentication.
Okay.
I wonder if that is where that is coming from. I would, if you think you're going to make a commitment to Keychain or one other, I would turn off the other one and try it and see how it works for you. Because I think that having multiples, Sue, I think that having multiples is going to be a problem.
Right. Thank you.
Marilyn's question: do I turn off Keychain when using LastPass? Yes, I would recommend that you do. But then LastPass is going to take over that function, all right? And LastPass will play in that role. All right. So the iPhone, the iOS app for LastPass will work on the iPhone. Okay. Other questions? Wow, this has been a fabulous session, folks. Lots and lots of questions. I can see that there's interest, right, in this. If you have other thoughts, don't hesitate to send me an email at don@donfred.com, and that I will look to respond as I can. Next Tuesday. Sorry for keeping you overtime. Wow, 23 minutes. Sorry. Next week we're going to talk about privacy, and I want to present some of the tools that Apple is providing us to help secure our online privacy. And this kind of goes to the space of, why is it that I can go to a website shopping for something, and then I go into my social media and all of a sudden I see all the advertising for that product? Let's break that down, and we'll talk about some of the tools that Apple is presenting in order to help with that and other situations. So, all right. So with that, I'll hang on the line for another minute or two. But with that, we are going to adjourn for the day. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. I hope you are having nice, healthy weather, warm weather, right? And we will hopefully see you next week.
Can I ask you another question, Don?
Absolutely.
I'm very, very guilty of using the same password for multiple accounts, and I'm going to get out of that and make some changes. And I plan to use Keychain to help me along on this.
Okay.
If I click on one of the sites that says this username or this password being used, will it automatically give me options, or do I have to pick my own password?
Yeah, you're going to have to. Well, there's no. Okay. Yes and no. So first of all, to go in and make a change on your password, there is no password manager that's able to go in and make that change for you, right? So in other words, you're going to have to do a lost my password strategy, or you're going to have to go into the site, and oftentimes if you click on your profile button on the upper right hand corner, there'll be a place where you can change the password.
Okay.
You're going to have to make that kind of action yourself. right? There's just too many variables out there to expect a password manager to be able to do that.
So it will throw up a suggestion.
But it'll offer a suggestion, yes. It will.
Oh, okay, good.
So when you are in the process of changing the password, so in other words, you've navigated to whatever space that you're changing the password, you will find that, you know, like if you're using your Safari browser, that it'll offer up a random password suggestion, right?
Cool.
And then
What
you
I'm
say,
looking
yeah, and then you say, well, wow, that's a random password. How will I ever remember that? And then you can say, I won't have to remember that because keychain.
It'll be a keychain.
Yeah, it'll
Yes.
be a keychain.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Good question.
Great session, man. Great session.
All right, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Other questions as we wrap up here? Okay, with that, we will adjourn.